I'm Francis Levy, co-director of the Philoctetes Center. Dr. Edward Necessian is the other co-director. And welcome to Susan Sontag, Public Intellectual, Polymath, and Provocatrice. Now, we're very excited about another forthcoming Philoctetes event, and that is that a group of youngish people who are people younger than I have been coming to Philoctetes. These are recent college graduates, mostly graduate students in varying fields, and interested in neuroscience and psychoanalysis, and literature and humanities. And what would happen is they would walk in here, and we would sort of kind of kidnap them, actually, because we do have a demographic that's a little bit in the other direction. So we got, and what happened is we've sort of quasi-empowered them. Well, no, anyway, they are going to be doing a series of events here at Philoctetes, and on the exact date of the first event, Lee, is what? July 10th, and they're going to be doing, the title of the event is unnamed, but really, in a strange way, tied into last Saturday's panel on psychogeography, because it's very much about place and the formation of identity. The art you see on the walls of the center upstairs here and in our adjoining annex represents the latest exhibit, Photographic Visions, The Art of Seeing. That's a Robert Polidori photograph on the wall in back of you, and he was on the panel, The Psychoneurology of the Photographic Arts. So this show, as many of our exhibitions, are attendant upon the round tables. All Philoctetes programming is also available if you go to www.philoctetes.org, and you can see any of our programs by going to past programming and simply hitting the button. For instance, this particular program, I'd say in about 3 or 4 days, will be up on the site. So now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Robert Boyers. Robert Boyers is the editor of the quarterly Salmagundi, which he founded in 1965, and director of the New York State Summer Writers Institute, which he founded in 1986. He was Tisch Professor of Arts and Letters at Skidmore College from 1995 to 2006, and has been a member of the English department there since 1969. He is the author of 9 books, most recently The Dictator's Dictation, Essays on the Politics of Novels and Novelists, and the short story collection, An Excitable Woman. He writes regularly for Harper's Magazine and has recently contributed essays on Susan Sontag, Nadine Gordimer, John Updike, and other writers. Robert Boyers will moderate this afternoon's discussion and introduce our other distinguished panelists. So thank you, Robert.
Thank you. I've been told to make these introductions very brief. You, I believe, have a sheet of paper with the biographies of each of the speakers, and so I will be really very brief. Joan Acocella is a staff writer for The New Yorker, where she writes primarily about books and dance, and a number of her books are indicated on your program. Roger Copeland is professor of theater and dance at Oberlin College and has written extensively on a number of different subjects. Philip Lopate, who is indeed one of America's foremost personal essayists, is the author of many books and, in fact, the author of a forthcoming book on Susan Sontag, which I read in manuscript in preparation for this occasion. James Miller is the chair of liberal studies and a professor of political science at the New School for Social Research, and is the author of 5 books. And I know for a fact has participated with me and a number of other people in this room in several different events involving Susan Sontag, symposia, panels, and so on. And I think it's fair to say that all of us on the panel have either written extensively about Susan Sontag or had very considerable interaction with her in panel discussions and symposia and so on. The format for today's event is really very simple. I mean, we intend to have a conversation. We do not intend to make formal presentations, but simply to talk. I think all of us come to the subject, to Susan's work, as people who've been in most cases conducting a kind of a conversation with Susan and her work for a very long time. I know that I have. I began reading Susan's work in the early 1960s when I was an undergraduate student in New York City, and certainly throughout the rest of my life, right up to the present moment, I've been conducting that conversation with her all along, and I have to suppose that that's been the case with everyone here. And so, without further ado, I'm just going to sort of put out an opening question and see where it takes us. Joan Acocella has argued that it is not usually a good idea to expect artists, and I suppose we might add thinkers or critics or essayists, to be ideal citizens. In the recent flap over Simone de Beauvoir, Joan writes, we see again what might now be called the Philip Larkin syndrome, the insistence on the part of modern critics that celebrated authors' lives be as admirable as their books, unquote. And I wonder, as a sort of question for the panel, whether it is your sense that this insistence is more than a little present in the criticism devoted to Susan Sontag in the year since her death in 2004. And if so, whether Susan herself might have had a hand in shaping this sense of her as not only a writer, an essayist, a critic, a novelist, a filmmaker, and even not quite simply either a public intellectual, but a kind of exemplary person, a model citizen.
Her favorite word.
Yes, exactly. So that's as an opening question.
She invited it, and David Reef, her son, since Sontag's death, Reef published those. I brought it. The sections from her notebooks and diaries, 1958 to 67, in which I put in my files because it raised my eyebrows so high. Sontag talks in here about being gay, which is something she didn't discuss publicly in her life and resented discussing. And she also says other things like, why do I betray all my friends? Mm-hmm. Which is rather more controversial, actually. Mm-hmm. So yes, and actually, when Sontag was writing about other people, very often she was writing about herself. Mm-hmm. And she couldn't help it because she was so, interested in being exemplary. But also, if you look at the narrators of, the narrator of Volcano Lover is almost provocatively autobiographical. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Philip. I, having just finished a book about Susan Sontag, I feel both at an advantage and at an immense disadvantage because I have almost too much to say and feel tongue-tied. But I'll say a few things. Sontag had a vexed relationship to the personal in her own essays. Especially the further along she got, she took a lot of pot shots at autobiographical writing, and thought that it was somehow there was something tacky about writing about oneself. And the irony is that some of her best and most persuasive pieces were personal essays. And I'm thinking of, for instance, the piece she wrote on Paul Goodman. And some of the other pieces, like there was a piece she wrote called Pilgrimage, which she never collected, about her visiting, as a teenager, visiting Thomas Mann. And so she had she was actually quite good at making herself into a character. I think the most characteristic example of this is Trip to Hanoi, which begins with a wonderful 30-page, very honest portrait of her boredom and irritation of being in this exemplary socialist society. And then she sort of like slaps herself and says, no, wrong, Susan, I must be wrong because they are right. And starts basically backtracking from her own impressions and being terribly moved at North Vietnamese minister who tears up when he talks about the people. So Sontag was somebody who both was very self-absorbed and very reluctant to write about herself. And I think that some of the backlash against the memoir and the personal essay that she and her peers engaged in was a kind of a class bias. Who are these nobodies who are talking about themselves? So she was down on it, and she also had a very ambivalent relationship to psychology. In Against Interpretation, many of you may remember how many times she'll quote Natalie Sarraute saying, the last thing we want in our books is psychology. Psychology was the enemy, just as interpretation was the enemy. And of course, interpretation and psychology go hand in hand, not to mention at times that her ex-husband was the enemy, having written a book about Freud, The Mind of a Mouse. Very good book, actually. So on the other hand, she wrote very perceptively and beautifully a number of biographical essays, such as the one about Walter Benjamin or the one about Artaud. So she used a lot of psychology, if you will, and in the trip to Hanoi, she confessed that what she really missed from being in this world of the commissars was psychology. So I would say that she really was split on this issue of the personal and split on this issue of psychology.
There's another interesting split in her. I think Joan began to hint at it, but the essay that you first mentioned, Trip to Hanoi, I think that's the first time that Sontag wrote fully in the first person. The word I doesn't even appear very often in her writing up to that point. And yet, the real paradox is that her only real continuing subject is herself. Now, I don't mean her private life, but
her taste,
her taste, her sensibility, her consciousness. Because so often, when she's writing about somebody like Canetti or Roland Barthes or Benjamin, she's only writing about those aspects of their work that she strongly identifies with, and that remind them of things she admires in herself.
Right. She's setting up a lineage at the end of which is her.
I mean, for example, when she talks about Barthes, she talks about his fondness for aphorisms, his formalist temperament, his belief that, quote, no venture is valuable unless it can be conceived as a species of radicalism. Now, if that's not a good description of Sontag, I don't know what it is. And the weird thing about the profile of Roland Barthes is that she hardly mentions the enterprise that he is best known for, which is his contribution to semiotics. That's not really of interest to her. So, it's like writing about Freud without mentioning psychoanalysis, or writing about Einstein without mentioning relativity. It's a very, very narrow take.
Well, can I say something to that? I'm not going to hog it, but I feel that Sontag was very influenced by Barthes' style and by Benjamin's style, and she saw them as models of a certain kind of witty, bemused way of dealing with intellectual topics. And certainly the aphorism she took the aphoristic style she took from them. But she herself was much more of a moralist, and she would get on a high horse, and she knew that she did this, that she had this tendency. This is actually, in a funny way, one of her more appealing aspects. But she could never do that thing that Barthes does, this wily kind of like being on both sides of the question at the same time. She inevitably would march into one side of the question. So her models, these European male writers, almost always male. She was always imitating them, but then what she ended up with was something that was Sontagian, which was not doing what they were doing.
She has a tendency. Sontag has a tendency, much more often, to open herself to making a fool of herself.
Yes, definitely.
And
the aphorism was one of the reasons why, because the aphorism led her into overstatement. When she made that remark about the white race being the cancer of humanity, it was a kind of overstatement. And the same thing when she said that readers would learn more truth from the Reader's Digest than they would from the Nation. And that was this kind of urge towards aphorism.
This was about communism.
But also the September 11th.
Communism is fascism with a human face.
her response to the September 11th attacks.
Right.
But also the other thing that makes her vulnerable to making a fool of herself is that she's such a moralist. When I knew Sontag because she was a dance fan, and so she was in the circle, the dance circles, and a particular fan of Mark Morris, on whom I was writing a book, and I wrote a long profile of Sontag, but in the course of that profile, you guys probably all know she could talk for 6 hours, no problem.
Right. That was a good profile, by the way, very useful.
Thank you. But very hard to do, by the way. She was not an easy interviewee.
I know.
Although she gave you a lot of material, but she was tireless, and I'm not. But all I'm trying to say is, I say it in this profile, but Sontag could go on for 6 hours about herself, and then at the end of it say, well, I don't want to talk about myself. I don't want to talk about herself. There is a way, despite the sort of acuity of this and some other things, Sontag was, in certain respects, very unself-knowing.
Very pre-psychological.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, about herself.
About
unself-knowing.
She reminded me in person sometimes of a kind of math nerd, in that she didn't know how she was coming across.
Yes.
And she would sometimes say these ferocious things, and people would leave bleeding and holding their heads, trepanned, and she didn't get it. She didn't know that exactly that she.
Yeah, my experience with artists. Now, you guys help me here and say what, but I do think a certain amount of tunnel vision. There was an article I read on Asperger's, and Mr. Asperger, Hans Asperger, said it is a little hard to make art without having a touch of Asperger's. And my experience with artists is not necessarily that they have no social sense, but they do have very often tunnel vision.
But sometimes they know how they're coming across. They know the impression they're making. And Sontag would say incredibly boastful things without being aware that she was saying something that was a little embarrassing.
Well, I would agree with you, except for the fact we have these journals, and it seems to me the journals are shocking because they indicate. If before I looked at these, and to be honest, I only looked at them yesterday, the Susan Sontag that I knew was exactly as you've described, but the person in this journal is someone else. Here's 1966, one of my strongest and most fully employed emotions. Contempt.
Right.
Contempt for others. Contempt for myself. I about fell over when I read that.
I know. I did too.
What about where she says, why do I betray all my friends?
Yeah. My image of myself since age 3 or 4. The genius schmuck. I want to go back to the question about exemplary lives. I mean, I want to take it in a different direction. There are two ways in which it seems to me, she took in and accepted the adulation of her as a public intellectual, and she made pronunciamentos on that basis. And she did it with a great degree of certitude. And was sort of shocked if anybody would question that. But I think the more important notion of exemplary for her comes out of her classical education, the exemplary life in Plutarch, in Plato. She knows by heart the exemplary philosophical lives, and she refers to them, actually, even in the very early essays. And it seems to me that it's very important that there's this whole cohort of people who went through the Hutchins College who, at absurdly tender ages, which I think is extremely important to her formation, at the age of 15 or 16, were yanked out of high school, put into the Hutchins College, and they were anointed as geniuses, and they were expected, because that was the curriculum, to master Plato and Aristotle, and to know it by heart. And in that context, I think that there's always in front of her the model of Socratic questing. And the question of whether she can measure up the true teacher. And the true teacher is Socrates. And then the second best will be the great teachers she had. The great teachers will include Leo Strauss and Kenneth Burke. Can she measure up? So you have a cohort of people, all of whom, I was thinking there's even a cohort of critics who come out of Chicago, all of whom have certain traits in common. They're all born within 4 years of each other. I made a list, actually, because I just wanted to make sure. George Steiner, born in 1929, goes to UC. Alan Bloom, born in 1930, goes to UC. Richard Rorty, 31. Susan Sontag, 33. They all, at different stages of their lives, are they want to measure up to this classic ideal of moral perfection. And they also want to be encyclopedic. They want to master the whole great books. And the measure so exemplary is on the one hand knowing a bunch of stuff, and on the other hand it's being a perfect kind of soul of a certain sort. And people who don't share this ambition because they're crass, money-grubbing schlubs and capitalists, because Hutchins had contempt for such people, are, they're like vermin of the earth. They sort of take you away. And of course the funny thing is all four of these people knew each other and they had contempt for each other. That's number one. And number two, that is a really punishing ideal. Yes. It is an absolutely rigorously punishing ideal. And if you take it seriously, which I think Susan Sontag did, it means you have no choice but to have contempt for yourself. And that is not a pleasant emotion to be burdened with. So I think that there's, in a profound sense, she was preoccupied with being exemplary. And it's not pretty.
That's very interesting. Very interesting. To what we were talking about before was as a psychological fact about Sontag is in some measure just the product of her education. Not just, but is the product of her education, and that education was so important to her.
But of course, the exemplary expression of those emotions that Jim just described was the essay written in admiration of someone she took to be exemplary in every sense. That seemed to me an extraordinary sort of gift that Susan Sontag had, and in many ways it was the gift that enabled her to write about certain figures who seemed alien, in the sense of difficult, in the sense of morally forbidding, to write about them with a special kind of sympathy and insight that made those figures accessible to a whole generation of people who were in various ways otherwise ill-equipped to make their way into the heart of the work written by those
I have
writers.
to wonder how many people rushed out to see Hans-Jürgen Sieberberg's Our Hitler.
But you've chosen the bad example.
Well, or Jack Smith's Flaming Creatures.
No. What about the long essays, though? That's who Robert is. That's the
Artaud essay, which is a brilliant essay. Artaud, nobody has written better about Artaud.
This was the introduction to a collection of Artaud's writings, and it's a very long. All these essays that Robert's talking about are Sontag's longer essays.
Yes,
exactly.
Sieberberg's a longer essay.
Yes. No. Sieberberg, Cioran, Canetti, Artaud, Roland Barthes, and who am I forgetting? But
there's one on Pavese, but it's not that long. But
Pavese though is in it's in Against Interpretation.
To follow up on Jim's point about the exemplary and being at odds with herself. One of the most curious things about Susan Sontag was obviously that she was a wonderful essayist who came to devalue essays more and more and to value fiction more and more. She was not a particularly good fiction writer. Some of her novels are pretty bad, and the Volcano Lover has definitely has merits, but have any of you read Death Kit recently? Death Kit or The Benefactor? I had this kind of comic relationship with her where I wanted to talk to her about essays, and she took that as an insult, she only wanted to talk about a fiction at a certain point because she had evolved into this model of the fiction writer, and this was somebody who could do essays extraordinarily well, you know. The other thing was that when I kept returning to the subject of essays. I was editing an anthology, The Art of the Personal Essay, so I was particularly engrossed in essays. And I noticed that when rereading all her work, she almost never mentions Montaigne, you know. And Montaigne is a figure who is so self-skeptical, who is not interested in perfectibility at all, who's interested in putting forward a vision of humanity as flawed, and let's accept that, you know. Let's be enchanted by our flaws, or let's just not, you know, not get too morally high horse about them. So I do think that this split between the essayist and the fiction writer was, you know, was very important.
Well, but I don't think, you know, what's interesting is I think her greatest pieces are not essays in the Montaigne sense. There are encounters with these alien personalities that take her outside of herself, that are themselves self-estranged in ways that she finds sympathetic. So Artaud and Roland Barthes, to me, are the paragons of that. And they're sort of sustained encounters with another soul, and sustained exercises of empathy, which, you know, face-to-face contact, she was often quite incapable.
No, and as a fiction writer, she didn't show much sympathy for her characters, nor did she show much humor, which are kind of two requisites for most good fiction.
But even at the beginning, she insisted on thinking of herself principally as an artist, as a novelist. Right. I mean, because if you look at the introduction to the paperback edition,
she talks about the essays.
This is a little interregnum between novel, right?
Yes,
you know, between The Benefactor and Death Kit.
And you know, it's a little bit like James Baldwin, you know, who was, you know, obviously such a great essayist and not a particularly good fiction writer, who often thought of the essays as kind of what he did to put food on the table, and of course he was the artist of fiction.
But of course all writers, you know, tell themselves stories which are often fairy tales about what they're up to or what they're supposed to be up to in order to get themselves to do some work.
Yes.
You know, and you know.
What fairy tale do you tell yourself?
I have a lot of them. I have a lot of them. You know, and
sometimes
those
afterwards.
That's afterwards. Yeah. Well, you know, a guy like me, you know, I have the fairy tale that putting out a little magazine for 40 years is a very important thing to do. You see? Now, how's that? I mean, you want a fairy tale. I mean, there's a fairy tale. I mean, you know, right?
And also, you know, let us not forget, even if we'd like to, that she also made films and directed plays and did collaborations with choreographers.
Opera criticism.
And the thing I think also to remember is that, like everyone else who is involved in doing the kinds of things Susan Sontag did over the course of 40 years, Susan Sontag had appetites and tastes that were peculiar. She might very well have found her way to certain writers, to writing about certain writers, who for one reason or another didn't seem to her interesting or compelling, or perhaps who had attracted other people to write well about them and thus didn't appeal to her as suitable subjects. So we might think, oh my, Susan Sontag, I mean, she must have had no interest in writing about this person or that. Well, maybe not. I mean, maybe in fact Susan thought about that, as many of us do, and decided that that work had already been done by someone else.
She said, my favorite writer is Shakespeare, but I don't write about Shakespeare because others have preceded me.
Actually, I wish she had gotten to Sebald before she did.
So she did only one piece.
She did this because he's such a thoughtful writer. He's really her kind of guy, you know?
Very much.
Not to speak of being Northern European, a guy, you know, a dead guy. Well, actually, he wasn't dead then.
No. Soon to be a dead guy.
Yes, soon to be a dead guy. But Sontag was writing on him when I was interviewing her, which is the year 2000, and it was too late. I don't know that she felt others had done it better, but she wasn't into her essay head anymore.
Those late essays, they are certainly weaker, and that's because at this point she was like a kind of she was a spotter. She would spot somebody and say, "This is it. Roberto Bolaño, put your money on this one. He's the real thing." And so there's not a whole lot more than just her assertion of her authority. This is what you. This is good. This is great. And she became very preoccupied toward the end of her life with this notion of greatness, and she only was greatness still possible in this debased age, and Sebald was somebody who she decided was great.
Yeah, and of course at that time I think that Sontag was wondering if she was great.
Yeah.
There was a lot of feeling, I don't know on whose part, but certainly on her part, that she should have gotten the Nobel Prize.
Yes.
And it was said cruelly that the work she did in Bosnia was she was making a pitch to get the Peace Prize.
Oh, I doubt that.
Well, you know that something that hasn't been mentioned but is maybe obvious to everyone is that she was a target for criticism and very catty criticism all her life.
Well, she was, for example, very late. She was chosen for the Jerusalem Prize.
Yes. Why is that so controversial?
It was controversial because she had to go to Jerusalem to deliver it, and many people in my own circle, in fact, which included some of the time Susan herself, felt that she should not have gone to Jerusalem at that time, because to do so was in effect to express a certain kind of implicit solidarity with the Israeli government, which everyone understood. Susan had no sympathy for whatever. And she decided to go. And if you read the text of her Jerusalem speech, it's pretty terrific. It's very candid. It's very canny. It's not simply an angry screed. It's very thoughtful. But it is, I think, the case that Susan understood that very often the Jerusalem Prize was given to someone who was about to get the Nobel Prize, and it made her think about that. In addition, of course, to the fact that right around that same moment, she won the National Book Award in Fiction for in America, which also was something that she very much wanted. She wanted to be recognized in an official way for a work of fiction, for a large, major work of fiction. And so, I mean, I think her thinking, went that way. I do have to say, and I don't want to speak at any great length about it, that I disagree with Phil on the subject of those late essays that Susan wrote. I completely agree with Phil that Susan could be awful and intolerable when she gave those speeches in which she declared herself the last remaining defender of literature with a capital L and so on. That was quite awful. But meanwhile, many of the essays that she wrote in the last 10 years of her life were written not about bona fide masterpieces like Sebald's novel, but about sort of minority books that had been overlooked and which, for example, the New York Review of Books editions had decided, Victor Serge, Machado de Assis,
that was
who was something like a major writer. That was the earlier book. Where the stress falls. And the book Summers in Baden-Baden, which is not major literature. I mean, so she, I think, decided at that moment that she could sort of propose these kinds of books to a large readership, books which might not otherwise have been read at all.
Well, and I think one of the most admirable things about her is that she was always a tireless partisan on behalf of lots of artists whom she never intended to write about, whether it was squat theater or this kind of obscure theater company called the Bilges Association that she talked up anecdotally. So, I think the fact that she spent so much time with art that she had no intention of ever turning into material for her own career. And in that sense, there's something very admirably generous, non-utilitarian.
Well, it's Phil was saying, a spotter.
You want to say something else? Come off this.
One of the things I keep coming back to, I was thinking, about the later essays and the early essays, and I think that Susan Sontag, her real historical importance was the essays of the 60s. I think the essays of the 70s are better as pieces of writing. But one of the things I would hate us not to lose track of is how she became famous. And what was it in those essays and against interpretation that made her into an emblem? in the way that she was. So she could be a gag line in a Woody Allen movie. She could be an intellectual Twiggy. You know, I mean, that's pretty amazing. And one of the things I think that, as I was looking back at Against Interpretation, because I don't think the essays have held up particularly well. I don't think she's a great critic in the way Edmund Wilson is, or Maurice Blanchot.
You mean in
in
that
France.
book?
In that book, I don't think they hold up particularly well. But I'm trying to understand historically, why did it matter? Why did it matter to me when I was younger? And there's a real pathos, I think, in those essays that I had not remembered, of somebody who's on the outside looking in, that they're a kid like her when she went to see Thomas Mann in L.A. and she's 14 years old. And there's this big world out there, and it's over in Europe. It's a secret society that we in America, it's been kind of kept under wraps, and it's really grand and important, and ideas make people bleed over there, and you know, we're watching Disney cartoons or something, and that, oh, and by the way, I also like the Supremes, and that this person was saying all of these things, and it was intoxicating at that moment. But if you take it out of that moment, and it doesn't seem to me to last all that well. But it also means to me, if I think of her of other 60s celebrities like Bob Dylan, you know, you've got a problem if you become famous when you're really young, and then in some sense you're always trying to top that first thing. And I think she actually had a little bit of that dilemma.
Well, I still am very impressed with the essays in Against Interpretation. I don't entirely agree with them, and I don't think maybe they're as good as some of her later essays, but I think they're terrific because they have this sense of lurching danger in them. You know, there's something. She's always on a tightrope, and and there's something very dramatic about these essays. Part of it is this presentation of this new free woman, who is this character, Susan Sontag, that is this spokesperson, who's the voice of them, and she's someone who's open to pleasure. She's someone who is unapologetic about being intelligent, and there's this, and there is an aggressiveness in them, which when I agree with delights me, and when I don't agree with makes me wince. But it's always she's advocating so strongly, and something else that interests me about it is that that book Against Interpretation is divided between polemics and rather measured critical statements, like the pervasive piece, but then there are these things where, like the essay Against Interpretation, and Notes on Camp is actually rather ambivalent, So I think that the performance aspect of those essays is still very exciting, dramatic.
There's an astonishing catholicity of taste represented in this relatively slender volume. The polarities of her sensibility are so fascinating. Opposites that
classical
were complete. Well, I'm not even talking about high and low now, but just in terms of, say, on the one hand, her interest in the deracinated tradition, the derangement of the senses. So the fascination with Artaud's theater of cruelty, or with the surrealist desire to terrorize the audience, the woman's eyeball being split open at the beginning of An Andalusian Dog by Dali and Buñuel, the essay on happenings where she talks about Alan Caprow in A Spring Happening ending the piece by pushing a roaring lawnmower at the audience in the Rubin Gallery and forcing them to scatter. So on the one hand, you've got this very assaultive fascination with something that minimizes the distance between artwork and perceiver. And then there's the whole other set of enthusiasms, Bresson and Brecht. I guess the persona essay is later on. But there's a lot of talk.
There is a connection, though. They both sides give cold comfort to the audience. I mean...
well, true, but... Right, but this other tradition is a contemplative tradition.
Right.
It's very much concerned with distance,
and she actually says at some point that all art has to be reflective, and I love that about her.
And there's this wonderful phrase that keeps turning up in Against Interpretation: coldness with pathos. So she realizes that the coldness, the distance, the contemplativeness is ultimately an emotional strategy. It's a barrier that will neutralize sentimentality, that will postpone gratification just enough to make the ultimate gratification that much more powerful.
And it's a formalist gratification to a great extent. You know, she was interested in. But I just want to argue with myself a little, which Sontag did not do, I think, in an essay. She mostly waited 20 years and then wrote an essay against an essay. But I sort of like to argue with myself. And the thing that I think is the aesthetic program she's putting forward. It's very exciting, her dramatic engagement with it. What I still find uncomfortable about it, what makes me uncomfortable, is there's a certain bullying aspect to it, which says you got to get with the program. You know, you bourgeois slugabeds. You know, she has a passage about the new novel where she says basically, painting has made the leap, music has made the leap. What is the matter with you, bourgeois realists? Fiction. We've got to, like it or not, we've got to get with it. And then years later, of course, as in Joan's profile, she says, I didn't really like those people wearing this clothes, but she talked herself into it. That was the radical side.
Yeah, but you know why?
That forced herself, she.
It's good for you, honey. Open up wider.
Exactly.
But I think that later repudiation of the nouveau roman people, the new novelists, is a little bit disingenuous. I think after The Volcano Lover, she was so pleased with herself that she could write a story. She could write a narrative.
But it wasn't an accident that she wrote The Volcano Lover. She reached the end of her rope in terms of the non-narrative, and she said, I better get some characters in here.
Yeah. Well, but she has said that she didn't think she had it in her, that she didn't think she was capable of it. So I think it came as such a pleasant surprise to her that she could write a book as straightforward. It doesn't have any of the narrative formal ambition of, say, Death Kit.
But what I'm saying, what's the same thing she does in her politics when she forces herself to end an essay, about posters, Viva Fidel, and says, you who are buying this book of Cuban posters, you can't understand the real context here. You're just consumers,
Yeah, she's tried to suppress that essay pretty much. I said she wanted us to forget about that essay. But that's a side of herself
that made her, that said chicken to herself, go all the way. Right. That's what you're saying when you say she sometimes took embarrassing positions. But I'm saying that's both bullying and self-bullying.
But it was so much a part of her personality.
No, I know.
I don't know what your experience was, but my experience with Sontag was that the time when I was interviewing her, which went on for months, I felt as though I were in a cage with in a cave with a dragon. I mean, she was quite brilliant and interesting and so on and so forth, but demanding, self-centered, uncompromised. The first time I ever went out to dinner with her, this is long before I asked to write a profile on her. By the way, when I asked Susan if I could write a profile on her, she said, well, I knew this was coming, but I thought it would be Janet Malcolm. Well, can you imagine such a remark?
That's pure
only from her.
That's her.
You've got to understand, this is what she was like. But when I was at dinner with her, Il Zucco was across the street from her house. And we're talking for a little while, maybe an hour or so, and she said to me, well, obviously you haven't read any of my work. And I said, well, of course I have. And I went home and I thought, it's because I wasn't talking about her work. Obviously, if I had read her work, that is the one thing in the whole world
that happened to me
that
too.
Would be so compelling that I couldn't not talk about it.
And especially one part of her work, which was her fiction, if you...
Absolutely. But the thing is, and I was just agape. This is what I mean about her taking positions and doing things that are really embarrassing. She was really embarrassing. Also, we can get out of this personal element, but boy, have I not forgotten it. Sontag's neediness, the immense neediness. She truly wanted me to say nice things about her. She truly wanted me as her friend, quote unquote, to be part of her circle and to be one of her people. She was immensely proud and self-deceiving about who were her friends. Yes. She would say, well, so-and-so is my very close friend. Mm-hmm. And I would have been on the phone with him the day before, and he'd say, that fucking bitch, and never speak to her again. She was, I said before, very unself-knowing. But I mean, this is what I mean about a little bit of Asperger's,
I want to come back to, we sort of talk about all of these things in the context of the question that Jim raised a few minutes ago, which was how it was possible for someone writing about the kinds of subjects that Susan covered in Against Interpretation to become a full-fledged celebrity, a person, in addition, who virtually every sophisticated person, certainly on the East Coast, had to be reading and talking about. In his book...
It was on the West Coast, too, Bob.
Yeah, it was on the West Coast. Yeah. I wasn't on the West Coast.
Okay.
Bill Lopate writes the following, just very, very brief. He writes that Sontag was, like all of us, a creature of her times, unquote. Which is, of course, in one sense, fair enough. But she was not perhaps a creature of her times quite in the way that most other writers are. Many people who disliked Susan and disliked her work often, in fact, claimed that she was entirely a creature of her times. She was a creature who knew how to ride the wave of the present. She knew how to make her work fit exactly the zeitgeist. She had a great nose for the way things were going. And her work expressed that. There were certain kinds of subjects that Susan knew well enough, in spite of the range that Roger cited. There were certain kinds of subjects she knew well enough to stay away from, because the kinds of people she wanted to appeal to would not be interested in those subjects. Right. She knew how to say, how to assure her constituency in Against Interpretation that, of course, even though she was interested in art and interested in making discriminations and interested in talking about what was first rate and what was not, she wanted nothing to do with the, her word, Arnoldian business of talking about masterpieces, in the Masterpieces 101 sense. So she knew how to deliver those kinds of sort of comforting reassurances. This is a criticism of Sontag that you can find, going all the way back to the reception of Against Interpretation, and it's a sense of her that's remained here and there throughout the last 40 years.
Yeah, Irving Howe's comments in the New York Intellectuals.
Irving Howe felt exactly that way about Susan. In fact, I mean, when I had Irving Howe and Sontag sitting at the same table for periods of days. Nice. They were both actually quite sort of astonished to find that they had things to say to one another, in spite of all of the nasty things they had said about one another behind one another's backs. But in fact, that was exactly Irving Howe's take on Sontag. She was a creature of the moment, and that, of course, is a very problematic sort of thing.
I actually think that Irving Howe is wrong about this, that what is peculiar about Against Interpretation is, and I must have subliminally picked it up, is how awkward it is, and how, there were other people at Partisan Review who were writing about similar kinds of ideas, William Barrett, etc. What's interesting to me is there's a kind of ungainliness about it, which I think spoke to me as someone who felt this was not a world I was born into. Irving Howe felt like he was a New York intellectual. Susan, it was like, I'd compare her a generation earlier to someone like C. Wright Mills. They were outsiders. They wanted to prove to New York intellectuals, I belong here. And so there's a kind...
You made that point about class before, and I think that was very interesting. Forgive me for interrupting you, but I wonder if the audience knows that Sontag came from a completely unintellectual family.
Right. And went to North Hollywood High School.
Yeah. Her father was a fur trader. Her stepfather was a force something or other.
Exactly.
What? She said at home they only talk drivel.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I interrupted you, but I thought it was an important point to make.
Because so it also goes back to the question of did she belong in the company of these people? And I think a mediocrity like William Barrett, I think had no qualms. You read the Truants, he belonged. But she didn't, even though she's much more interesting. And there's a passage, I just want to read to you to see what you make of it, because I was just floored by this. It's in an essay on Simone Weil, and it just drew me up short, because I'd read it a long time ago, and I didn't remember it. And it's just so weird. And it's the strangeness of Susan Sontag occasionally that you find in this work, so that it's not of its time, I don't think. Because she's talking about Simone Weil and Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, and she says rather offhandedly, well, of course, most of their modern admirers could not and do not embrace their ideas, which is a strange thing to say in 1963. We read writers of such scathing originality for their personal authority, for the example of their seriousness, there's the word example again, for their manifest willingness to sacrifice themselves for their truths, and only piecemeal for their views. This is the sentence that floored me. As the corrupt Alcibiades followed Socrates, unable and unwilling to change his own life, but moved, enriched, and full of love, so the sensitive modern reader is like Alcibiades, pays his respect to a level of spiritual reality which is not and could not be his own. It is as if the example of Kierkegaard and of Nietzsche and of Simone Weil, she's watching it through a glass darkly. She can't, this is this absolute reality of some kind of...
Her Kantianism,
I just find that an amazing...
That actually, it's a very striking statement, and just shows... maybe this is... She just shows how far she would go.
Yeah.
And that's part of what everyone loves about against interpretation.
Yeah, I think this business of the awkwardness is definitely in there, because I think that she was not always a very elegant writer. Sometimes she was a clumsy stylist. But always you felt this power of a mind trying to work itself through. And I definitely don't think that she was a zeitgeist opportunist. I think that I just don't see her that way. I think she was, in a way, too self-absorbed to be such a great opportunist.
And what's distinctive about her is that she holds these elements of the zeitgeist to classical standards.
Yes.
She has a lot in common with Clement Greenberg in that regard, even though they would differ in others. But the avant-garde for her, or whatever one calls the most progressive, spiritually strenuous, all of those adjectives that she loves about difficulty, that work has to be able to hold its own alongside the great classical landmarks. And I think that's what's distinctive about her, is that she's a bridge. She is an Arnoldian in the final analysis, who also likes the supreme.
Yeah, and more she becomes Arnoldian as she gets older, because at a certain point she becomes estranged from the culture. Not only is she not necessarily the representative of the zeitgeist, but I can't name the year entirely. Maybe it's 1979, but she becomes alienated from the culture, and youth, which had seemed the great solution, now she sees as not the great solution. But I don't agree exactly with Jim in that. I don't think that she was such an outsider. I think she was a bridge. She was a lot of these Irving Howe people were older than she was, and she was this very cute, and with it, younger person who was going to explain to them what Flaming Creatures was all about. She was going to, they were getting sclerotic and everything, and she was going to, bring this breath of fresh air into partisan review,
But what she said about Flaming Creatures is I thought much more interesting than Flaming Creatures.
Well,
Much
yeah.
more.
Well, yeah. She saw a film in Flaming Creatures, she wrote about it, But
Siren, too. I mean, I'd rather read those than Siren.
And you'd certainly rather read Susan on the story of O than read the story of O.
yeah.
That's where
I figured that would be the test case. That would be the test case.
But that's really funny. In the diaries that were mentioned, that Jim mentioned, she says about a story review, she says, I'm finishing the story of overview, which has turned into a 35-page essay. It's okay. Still, I don't believe a word I'm saying. It's interesting, maybe valuable, but I don't see how true. So she was able to create this assertive persona even when she herself had doubts about it. She did not argue inside her essay.
It's such a wonderful quote, though, that business of true. That she actually, if I had a nickel for every time I heard somebody quote that line of Edwin Denby's, it's not the job of the critic to be right, but only to be interesting. Sontag did not believe that. And she said to me that, the reason she very often went through 10 to 15 drafts on an essay was she would read it and say, that's not true. And throw it away. She actually thought she was producing truth.
But she published a story of O essay,
But I mean, after Heidegger, we're all supposed to think, truth is relative. She doesn't think that.
But also, I think a lot of her value judgments turn out, in retrospect, to be not just really sound, but very prescient. I mean,
she was good taste.
Who else in the early '60s understood that Ionesco was not as great an artist as Beckett? I think at that point in time, everybody who'd read Martin Eslin's book Theater of the Absurd thought, these guys are all sort of equally interesting. And she saw through Ionesco in a way that hardly anybody else did.
No, she had, she did have very good taste, but something that puzzled me about her was her relationship to American critics and American thinkers, that she was so reluctant to either to be influenced or to admit that she was influenced. She was always talking about, Barth and Benjamin, but, here were all these people like, Edmund Wilson and Clement Greenberg, and actually the whole post-war era of America was this glorious time of critical prose and non-fiction prose, and she treated it like a desert,
there's no Dwight MacDonald as if he didn't exist. The high-low distinction challenge.
Randall Jarrell case,
you just run through it.
As Philip said,
Trilling,
the post-war,
Wilson,
the 50s.
Rosenberg, Robert Washoe, Manny Farber.
This was a great period, and she completely ignored it. Or, I'm sorry, made no reference to it.
And the funny thing is, a lot of these people were saying the same thing she was. Like, for instance, Manny Farber was talking about white elephant art versus termite art, and basically saying, don't be fooled by moralistic stuff. And Pauline Kael was savaging things that seemed bloated, and Sontag was arguing for transparency and against interpretation, So she was arguing for the same kind of formalistic values that Manny Farber was arguing for.
You've recently worked on her, and I haven't. Is there, it's widely known that after an artist dies, very often the reputation goes. There'll be a sag in the reputation. I was very curious about this piece by Elliot Weinberger in the New York Review of Books. And it's a very strange essay. Let me say one thing is that Sontag wrote for the New York Review of Books. I'm sure many of you know.
And she was so crucial to them. She didn't just write for them. She was one of the. She was a house.
Exactly. She was a house guy, close friend of Barbara Epstein.
And this bothered me. The funeral baked meats were barely cold.
Absolutely. This is from 2007, so it's 3 years after she died. But it's a very striking and very ambivalent job. I have the sense Phil, that this the last 3 lines
are completely wrong, by the way.
No, but Sontag seems to have had nothing stupid about her at all.
Right.
Dead wrong.
That's true.
Arguably the most important literary figure or force of the last 40 years, she may ultimately belong more to literary history than to literature. Though I shouldn't have read you those 3 sentences. I was curious about what you thought, because most of this piece says that she was wrong about everything.
Yeah, no, I think first of all, I don't agree that she was more important to literary history than to literature. I actually think that that her great contribution was to belletristic writing, but I think that the Weinberger piece is very peculiar because it actually is very astute in certain ways, but lopsided, and in some deep way kind of mean-spirited in that he says, for instance, I think the fact that Weinberger was a very, very smart guy, is essentially an avant-gardist. That's a curious thing. He indicts her for not having reformed the form of the essay.
Which is one thing I love about it.
And I think, not being a chronic avant-gardist, think, if anybody writes essays as well as Sontag, they don't have to write lyric essays or rupture the form. I'm glad for her. I mean, that's an interesting thing that she came up during that whole period of the death of the author and the fluid self and all that, and yet she herself was always projecting a coherent self, and that was quite traditional in a way. I like that about her.
Yes.
But he lambasted her for that.
I had the sense that this was, speaking of the zeitgeist, that this was. Finally, there was a general feeling that somebody had to throw down
a market correction.
Exactly.
Right. From somebody other than Hilton Kramer. In other words, there have been lots of this is it was edited by Paolo Di Leonardo, who was her translator and her constant companion. I don't know who Ann Jump is. Who's that?
I don't know.
All right, and with a foreword by David Reef. Reef has recently published a book on.
You're speaking now of the book.
I'm sorry.
Not the Weinberg article.
Elliot Weinberger's essay is a review of Sontag's literary remains, which called All the Same Essays and Speeches.
Same time, yeah.
But what I'm saying is, it's a company. The book, her book, is a company product. There are all these. Reef has recently published a book that. Some people may find a little tortured something to appear in public. The book has to do with Sontag's board, and is this related to what we've been talking about? Her hunger to live, so great that she simply, when the final cancer came, she simply could not admit it, and Reef grieves in this book and in essays that have come out of that book about whether he grieves over the thought that he misled her in going along with this idea. Reef is keeping her name alive. I
think there were a bunch of market corrections after she died, but I think that. And it was interesting because I think to some degree people were letting out a sigh of relief because they were so intimidated by her when she was alive that now they stepped forward and said, actually, But I do think that, but since I admire Sontag, I think that she, for all her flaws, I think that she will continue to have an important place in the culture. But
can I just say one thing? Just one point of information, and that is that in the course of Sontag's lifetime, many critical pieces appeared on her work.
Many.
And many of them were written by people who knew her very well, myself included, James Wood included, who wrote a less than fulsome piece on Susan's novel in America, which Susan talked about considerably, in which he faulted her as a novelist for having decided to take the easy way and write historical fiction, which James Wood explained was the novelist's easy way. she didn't basically cast him out as a result of that. I mean, they remained good friends, and she continued to extol his work and write blurbs on the back of his books and so on. There was no problem. So I would want to sort of not suggest that Sontag was as a writer, as an intellectual in the scene, someone who didn't know how to take criticism and who couldn't respond, more or less in a mature way, to criticism that wasn't intended to be murderous, to obliterate her, to pretend, in the way, by the way, that James Wood has sometimes pretended, that there's absolutely not one word that one can say for a serious writer that one is writing about. So, and I think it is, to be fair, at least, that Sontag...
No, I don't think that the people who were terrified of saying anything about Sontag while she was alive were her social inferiors. Wood was not a social inferior.
Definitely not.
So that's not the same thing.
Okay, well, that's okay. That's important.
Something else that I think we should mention, at least in passing, just to flesh out the portrait of Sontag, the person, is that even if she was a kind of sacred monster in private, that some of the things that she did as a public intellectual were unbelievably heroic and important. And I'm not just talking about Sarajevo, but when the Ayatollah put the fatwa on Rushdie in when was it, 89? She was president of American Pen, and the people who would usually sign, that would usually rush to sign the freedom of speech petitions were making a very hasty exit, and she was tireless.
Sontag was heroic and courageous, and that was part of her character.
Yeah. So I give her a lot of credit for that. Maybe part of the motivation is moral grandstanding, a sense of.
She inspired me. I remember just a short letter that she wrote in the New York Review of Books. This is when Sontag was becoming an absolutist about politics. Before that, we were all supposed to understand other cultures that weren't Euro-American. And finally, Sontag did a reverse on that.
She said morality is morality.
Became a moral absolutist. And so cultures, no matter how much they may have been oppressed before, no matter how much they were different from successful white people, if if today she were here and could see what happened in Burma, you would. But I remember reading. I can't remember what the situation was, but it was a letter by Sontag that was short. It was about that long, and I read it and I thought, you're right. She punctured a very important liberal nostrum there, and I was grateful to her.
Well, she and Bob Dole were really, almost alone in calling for the bombing of Serbia. She was a very, way before Clinton actually took any military action.
I think part of the development of Sontag was to move her in her first book, in the first two books of essays, she's very drawn to the opaque, slightly mysterious, mystifying, what exactly is she saying kind of statement, and then toward the end, and the writer of this letter is obviously somebody who's not interested in that kind of epigrammatic opacity,
Yeah.
But that's partly the difference between aesthetics and politics, isn't it? Harold Pinter, when he writes about politics, is absolutely unambiguous, whereas Harold Pinter, the playwright, is
but I think she actually worked through that style. She worked through that demystification style that was kind of Adorno-esque. She put it on for a while, and then she kind of said, okay.
I think that's absolutely true. What was so important about this book was its celebration of the conflicts and tragedies and so on and so forth of consciousness.
Right.
So as Weinberger says in her here, she really was working material that had been already worked up by surrealists and Marcel Proust and so on and so forth. So she's interested in that sort of kingdom of relativism, which is consciousness. She grew up You know, almost like my mother. My mother, doesn't think any longer that other people have a point of view. She's had it with their point of view, and that's one of the actual pleasures of being mature is that you don't feel you have to be making concessions, or always, particularly if you're an intellectual, that you don't always have to think this is my point of view, and then these are the 4 other legitimate points of view.
That's the difference between the first remark she makes about Leni Riefenstahl and later on Fascinating Fascism, where she says, no, I'm not having any of this.
But I mean, it's in a way, it's a stage of life, and I don't think it's I don't think it's arteriosclerosis. I think she had legitimate stages.
Right.
She's polymorphous in a way. She's not only polymathic, but she's polymorphic.
Well, but
you like the story of O, as I recall.
And I think.
Non-ideological. I mean, and don't find
Say it again.
totally non-ideological. She just changes. She goes against herself.
Well, I mean, it depends what you mean by ideology.
She changes completely. The photography.
All right, but
they're totally different.
changeability doesn't mean you're non-ideological.
Ideology. I think she was ideological.
Yeah, I think she was ideological and changeable. I mean, frighteningly changeable. And very often she didn't acknowledge that she was changing her mind, which annoyed many people who were, of course, I mean, she had because she was so famous, there's a problem with being famous. The downside of being famous is people know what you wrote 20 years ago. And so that, that was a difficult thing.
Well, I wanted to go back, actually something that you were saying, talking about, and this whole issue of her connection or disconnection with America. There was one of the smart things I thought in the Weinberger essay was when he talks about her as being a cosmopolitan who's curiously provincial, which I think that rings a chord with me. But the whole question...
I don't get it. Could you explain how? I don't get that at all. I'm sorry.
You don't get the chord?
He makes a mistake by saying that she wasn't interested in Asian art, but she was very interested in Asian art.
I say that's not the context. The quintessential cosmopolitan, there was something provincial in her unabashed idolatry of the great, in her need, though she railed against American consumerism, to consume every book, play, opera, ballet, and dance performance.
And not just a misuse of the word consume.
Let me follow this. Okay, so you guys hate this.
That's only one of the places.
She is so against the anti-intellectualism of America, which is such a salient feature of her coming from the class background she did, that the form of intellectualism that she adopts is, I think, incredibly rarefied and is exaggerated and extreme in a way that is false to some of the better prototypes we have available for American intellectuals. And so I see her sort of as being in this strange outlier role. I mean, she's Eurocentric in an almost cartoonish way. She's exactly like Alan Bloom in that way to me. Exactly. There's no difference. The contempt for the mass. The contempt for consumer society. There really are very few passages in Against Interpretation about Dionne Warwick and the Supremes. They're just sort of blips.
Also, that's a little false. I don't think Susan liked the Supremes very much. And also, if she were going to have some
kind of
down-home taste, she could have chosen better than the Supremes.
Catches getting down to it,
Bruce Springsteen and the Doors, and she had pretty good rock.
Sontag was very often heard to point out that she did not have a television set.
Yes. I analyzed that passage of the 9/11 where she talks about how she...
But this whole question of what is an American intellectual, what can you aspire to, what can an American critic be, insofar as we step back from just Susan Sontag and say, in the whole panoply, the people from the Hutchins College, the only one who sort of embraced America at the end was Rorty, Emerson, Whitman, and it's very striking because for the rest it's sort of like, ugh.
Yeah.
You know, we went to a college built by Rockefeller. Ugh. And thank God it was Gothic architecture. And
could you explain to us how she got from this background to the University of Chicago?
well, you did the button.
I want Phil to do it. Actually, I'm not that good at it. She was a brilliant child.
But who recognized her? Did she apply? Did they come after her?
Do you know, Phil?
Well, I don't think it's quite. I love Jim's kind of Village of the Damned idea that there were these children who were isolated. It's an amazing myth, you know, but I don't think it was quite like that. I think she applied to the college and she got in.
Well,
look,
there's some background here that just factually is Hutchins believed that you should rescue children from American idiocy at the earliest opportunity. The reason you had great books is high schools were derelict in their duty, and if you could find somebody who could test out an appropriate level and they were 12 years old, you would admit them to the college. So when these prodigies came, somebody had to get her to apply. That's true. Yeah. But it's an extraordinary hothouse that you had in Hyde Park during those years, and they were very aware of who was the youngest. I mean, you can read memoirs by Stanley Rosen. It's astonishing. So she was one of these kids at age...
And she married at 17? Or
yeah. And
one of her professors.
One of her professors.
It was a very unusual institutional matrix that produced this group of critics. That's all I want to say.
But also, Susan didn't know to go to Hutchins
I think
College.
she took a
She
train.
went to Berkeley,
Yeah.
which I'm very interested in your question, and I don't know the answer to it. Sontag says. She said in the essay, the Thomas Mann, the one Pilgrimage, and she also said to me and to many others that she was brilliantly precocious and sophisticated as a teenager. So she was reading Partisan Review when she was 13 or 14. She was, she and her boyfriends would sit and discuss Mozart, while others were, making out and sucking their thumbs and stuff like this. I wonder how much self-mythology, I know people who think that Susan didn't go to visit Thomas Mann.
Well, maybe that's why she didn't put that in her collected.
But she's a very good. I won't say self-mythologizer because we all organize, particularly anyone who's been interviewed. My finding about people who've been interviewed, very often, I have to interview people, and the older they are, the tougher it is, because they've been interviewed too many times. So they've already made up the story.
And Sontag had something in addition to that, which is the one and only time I ever interviewed Sontag. We already, were more or less acquaintances of each other, and we had a wonderful conversation. I found her very open. She spoke actually very tenderly about Philip Reif. And then I turned on the tape recorder, and this incredible monster rigidity came out. It was so different, and suddenly very angry and defensive. And I thought, wow, But I was so glad I got a chance to see the other person, who was talking so fluidly,
Well, look at the first section of In America.
I'm sorry, Phil. What are you saying? That she seemed to you warm and interesting while you were speaking to her, and then when you got home and listened...
I turned on after talking casually and freely for an hour. I turned on a tape recorder, and she completely transformed.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you meant when you listened to the tape.
No, she completely transformed herself.
But all right, yeah.
Because once she was put on the spot, once she was in a panel discussion, for instance, she would very often become, so rigid,
I think like a lot of people, Susan Sontag was one way some of the time, and a very different way other times. Some of the time it had to do with the way her meds were working and were not working. This is just very obvious and simple. It's really quite elementary in that sense. But I did want to also mention that I knew only two people who knew Susan Sontag well when she was at the University of Chicago. One was Philip Reif, who was her husband, and the other was David Reisman, the author of The Lonely Crowd. and two very different people. I mean, enormously different people. Different in terms of temperament and the nature of their work and so on, though both were nominally sociologists and taught in sociology departments, and both attest to the fact that Sontag was, at 17, the most brilliant student they had ever met. That she was precociously and obviously, unmistakably brilliant. And she had read more than any other 17-year-old they had ever met, and so on. So there was that.
And I believe
I
the
knew
Thomas Mann story, and that was
do
the
too.
story she told me that that I also believe that after her first year at the University of Chicago, I don't remember how I asked her. I think it was an innocent question at your house one night about where she first read Walter Benjamin, and she said, well, you know, I didn't want to spend the summer and go back to L.A., and so I decided I would go to the University of Wisconsin and go to summer school, and I was going to go study with Hans Gerth, who was the great, had translated Max Weber and had collaborated on a book with C. Wright Mills. And so this would have been in 1949 or 1950, and Hans Gerth handed out that summer mimeograph translations of Adorno and Walter Benjamin. One of the things about her being precocious is that she was onto stuff way before most other people. Yeah. This is a decade before critical theory, before Marcuse, One-Dimensional Man, which made Marcuse famous, or Eros and Civilization. It's years before all of that. She later came to know Marcuse. So, you know, there is a sense of this, you know, of this kid, instead of doing the normal teenage things, that she would do later when she was in her 30s.
But, I mean, I wonder, I think I want to point out to the audience what an important thing this is in a critic. It's not absolutely essential in a critic, but I think critics that we cherish the most as living operatives in the society, and I'm thinking of Edmund Wilson here, are people who broaden our subject matter. It's very tempting, I speak as a critic, it's very tempting to not to say, I just saw this and you should see it. This is the greatest. Because you think, if you're me, you think to yourself, you know, let me give it one more season. This could be a flash in the pan, blah, blah, blah. But actually, the critics who are uniquely helpful to people interested in the arts are the ones who'll go out on the limb. It was so important about Edmund Wilson, and once he gave it up, you know, he brought a lot of that European you know, a lot of that European literature for the first time. He reviewed it. He was, I think, writing about Ulysses the year after it was published or something like this. Americans had never heard of it. It hadn't been published in America because it was too dirty. It was, you know.
The essays on symbolism.
Yes, absolutely. I'm thinking of Axel's Castle. Yeah. But Sontag took on that duty. Now it's part of her boldness, but God bless her boldness for that, you know.
Oh, yeah. Do we have questions? I was going to just, yes, indeed.
If you have a question, come to the microphone.
Okay, great.
Yes.
It'll come to you.
I have a very loud voice.
It's not for the voice, it says.
Okay. I have been an admirer of Susan Sontag for many years. I loved her essays. I read her last book about an American, something or other about the actress, can't remember it. I just about slogged through. I hated it. I didn't identify with this woman. I didn't like her, and whatever. So I was disappointed in her as a novelist. But I never read Under the Volcano. Was
Volcano Lover.
The other volcano. Okay, Volcano Lover.
That's the one you should have read.
Under the volcano.
I would just like to mention two things that were not mentioned here. Yeah. There was no other American woman that can compare to her as a thinker, as an essayist. I've seen her on panels only with men. I don't recall seeing her on a panel with another woman, because I think the other woman just would have shriveled beside her.
We had many of them, but that's
yes.
Often she was the token woman.
I mean, she definitely was the total genius, getting into the school at 16. The way I identified with her is that when we were both 18, we had children. This was not mentioned at all. This certainly slowed her down, considering her output and her genius and everything else she accomplished. Without the child, I'm sure she would have accomplished much more.
I'm not sure how much it slowed her down. If you read those diaries, how she put David to bed and then went off to a party.
Yeah. That's true. Nevertheless.
Or took him to the party and had him sleeping on everybody's couch.
Took him to the film
had to be involved in his schooling and teaching him. I read his book after she died. He honored her. He adored her. He competed with her. He ended up being a writer and a thinker in his own right. She didn't destroy him. She didn't castrate him. This has to say something about Susan Sontag.
That's good. That's very good.
I know that I met her briefly in publishing and in poetry circles, and I know she hasn't, not maybe commonly associated with poetry, but she was a real champion of. This is getting back to the point you were making. She had a way of making foreign names or unknown names. I know the Australian poet Les Murray, a Serbo-Croatian writer of Osco Pope, but she had a way of making these extremely urgent, and as they should have been. Mm-hmm. And these are completely, even Joseph Brodsky, who she became friends with very, very early on, she became a great admirer of hers and of his, and was in publishing circles and in critical circles. She could talk it up and bring a kind of an urgency to it that they deserved, and no one else seemed to have the time or space for. And this, I just thought she was just this, just very, very engaged in a way that was, in a way that a critic really should be. I mean, she was wholeheartedly, and I know was responsible for getting people published that wouldn't have been published, and.
That's true.
Great, a close reader and a real lover of literature, and just became enthusiastic and had to have people in the publishing and critical world aware of it. So
this is Michael Brazilla, who runs our poetry series.
Yes.
Can I say that I think that's a crucial point about against interpretation, is that it made it's just that it was exciting. It made art exciting, and that sounds like a very brutally blunt and simple statement about against interpretation, but truly I believe that's the center of.
And it's true about subsequent books as well.
Yeah, but not quite like that.
Right.
Actually, what I would say, well, against interpretation actually flames on the surface. But, for example, when she wrote on photography, that was a living issue. And that book was tremendously exciting to people in the questions that it raised about photography, which at that time was, everybody was, doing salam to photography.
It was, you might mention this in the same way, that in the early 60s, when the French New Wave began to emerge, and emerged in a very powerful way in the States, filmmakers of a somewhat older generation like Ingmar Bergman were often condescended to outside of what might be called mid-cult circles. When Sontag had the courage to write a long piece on Bergman's persona that's collected in Styles of Radical Will, she turned that around completely. It suddenly became possible. It did. It suddenly became possible to take Sontag seriously as an avant-garde filmmaker, rather than Bergman as an avant-garde filmmaker, rather than simply as a purveyor of sort of profoundly angst-ridden films, like The Silence and so on.
But she also makes it very clear that persona is the one great exception to the rule. The Silence is also the only other Bergman film she admires, and she calls him the Fellini of the North. In that sense, she's, it's a kind of double whammy at both Fellini and Bergman for being intellectually middlebrow. I mean,
has anyone seen Sontag's films?
Yes, I have.
Yes.
Because Brother Carl, which I guess is the best now.
Duet for Cannibals.
Yeah,
Duet for
the
Cannibals.
films are tough going.
They are really tough.
Although easier, I would add, than the two novels that Phil mentioned.
The only one that works for me is Promised Lands, which is a kind of documentary.
Yes, about Israel.
About Israel, yeah.
Yeah, but Brother Carl is like very bad Bergman.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, exactly.
We have more questions?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a quick question, if either of you can confirm the fact that at the end of her life, she went to the movies every day.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I don't. Well, actually, I didn't know her at the end of her life. I knew her from the 1990s, and then she didn't like the profile that I wrote on her at all, and did not want to be friends with me anymore.
Though it was very positive, I thought.
I thought.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
But in any case, no, I don't think she. But you know, she was way too ill to be going to the movies every day. May I ask you, actually, to go back to something you said? How her meds? Did Sontag take psychoactive drugs, or are you talking about the painkillers she was on?
No, I'm talking about psychoactive drugs that she took long before she became ill with her final illness.
Oh, all right. So this is something I didn't know. I didn't know this.
Yeah.
She was on antidepressants.
I don't know what I don't know the names of the drugs, and so I wouldn't pretend to talk about.
All right, but I mean, one thing that is worth pointing out is how much time she spent sick.
Yeah.
When I was interviewing her, she couldn't walk very well because she was getting shot a heavy metal drug that she was taking for pain. She had neuropathy, nerve illness. And I know that when she wrote the conclusion, the end of this novel that has been disparaged here in America, there's a huge, long, I think, 30-page rant by Edwin Booth. And I was told that Sontag wrote the whole thing in a cloud of painkillers in a hotel room to get away from the telephone.
That explains it. Yeah.
Exactly, and that's what the person who was a close friend of hers was saying to me. Is that explains it? That the kind of explosiveness and at times tiresomeness of that speech.
I would just like to tell you that I really loved the Volcano Lover. Really
it's the best book.
I mean, I don't want you to put the two books together because I thought that was a really
But the thing is, I was actually I kind of liked. In America.
Me too.
The only problem with In America is its kind of tinkly, metallic, emotional quality. Really none. There you are. She really didn't love any of those people. Whereas in The Volcano Lover, the collector, Hamilton, Emma also, but above all the collector, Hamilton, and the scene, the part. I think it's called Phlegmatic, the third part, when Hamilton dies. His thoughts as he's dying, it's just tremendous. It was really tremendous.
Great.
I didn't know she could do that.
Mm-hmm. And she didn't know that she could do that.
And believe me, those two first novels where she was trying to be a novelist, they are excruciating. They are terribly, terribly boring and bad.
Yeah, they're so turgid and heavy.
It was not boring.
Yes, I thought.
A month to get through it.
I don't know.
I felt it was a duty.
I didn't like it as much as The Volcano Lover, and that was actually hard for me because my profile, like many magazine articles in the world, had an occasion for it. Most magazine articles are written they have what is called a hook, and the hook for my profile of Sontag was the publication of In America. And therefore, I was under a little bit of pressure to like that book, and that was hard for me.
Well, some of her most personal revelations are actually in the first section of In America, where the narrator is clearly an alter ego.
That's a first person, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's clearly an alter ego for Sontag. And when the character talks about her first husband having been Mr. Kassebaum from Middlemarch, I mean, this is something that Sontag has said about Philip Reef on numerous occasions.
No, of course. Any other questions?
Well, I want to ask, Phil Blomberg is the only analyst in the room who really knew Susan Sontag pretty well. Any thoughts that you want to?
Yes, what I've heard today just sort of very much mirrored my experience. That under the surface, the needfulness and the shame that she often had about her own work and the doubt that she had in some of our conversations.
You knew her well. Then you knew that Susan was in analysis. Or actually therapy. I'm not sure.
She was in therapy.
All right. And I don't know the name of the doctor. I know that it was she and that she was South African and Jewish. That's all I know.
She was a self-psychologist that Susan saw.
A self-psychologist,
yes.
Yeah. And you do it.
She saw someone who was very interested in the work of Heinz Kohut and who was very interested in how how to describe self-psychology.
Regulation of self-esteem.
Yes, it was very interesting in the creation of in the creation of self-esteem.
Wow.
Yeah.
Meaning that you go in having too much or too little?
Too little.
Okay.
Meaning you are constantly going up and down, depending on how things are happening around you in life.
But it would have been interesting to be a fly on the wall in Susan's in Sontag's.
Somebody who had a very, very, very difficult early life, who had been hurt and felt very, very unlistened to. Mm-hmm. And I think in a certain way, part of her life was really organized around revenge. Mm-hmm. And she knew that about herself in certain ways. I mean, she's like everyone else. In the context, she could be very open and very psychologically minded. I was also, though, very surprised at when I read the journals, the things that David published. I had no idea she had ever seen. Certainly, the conversations that we had, I thought were very open, but nowhere near as open as she could be in her writing.
I dropped my jaw when I read those, and not just at the candor, but it was so early. It's so early. This is 1957 to 63 or something. What she knew about herself already. But I mean, I'm sure that you understand better than I do that analysis does not necessarily confer. That self-knowledge that it confers does not necessarily lead one to act in reasonable or generous ways.
Believe me. That's true for analysts as well as
that's debatable.
But a lot of people I know who've been in analysis use self-knowledge as an excuse to act in an irresponsible way because they think, well, I know myself. You know, you also want to screw your mother, so let's, you know.
My mother is sitting here, so let's not get too.
That was classic.
You couldn't have set that up.
My father used to say, Oedipus manifests as long as he loves his mother.
Yeah, there's a question here. Yes,
I want to say one thing. I just want.
Wait, can we pass the microphone on?
No, the only thing I wanted to say about Susan is that there were people for whom, Susan was somebody for whom human relationships were very dangerous and very fraught. And I think her writing is about that. I think a lot of the novels are about that. And I think in a certain kind of way she was always looking for instruction on how to be a person, how to be related in certain kinds of ways. books, in a funny kind of way, served as her own parent.
Yes.
She used her brain as a thing she could grow up with, and there are great advantages and great disadvantages to doing that.
It's very interesting.
You will often find in Sontag a statement that's extremely wise and compassionate, which shows she understood this notion of sympathy and where you wanted to go. She understood it, she just couldn't always do it in reality. Go ahead.
I wanted to suggest that your mother...
Did you say who you are?
Oh, Elaine Baruch. I wanted to suggest that you have your mother take a bow. Talking about mothers, and Susan Sontag as a mother, there's been a lot of admiration shown for her as a mother. She left David alone for long periods of time. I don't mean without somebody watching him, but she took off. I think she left him with her in-laws for practically an entire year. This was not unusual. Of course, Margaret Mead did something similar, and I don't see that the kids turned out any the worse for wear. And as far as David adoring his mother, well, maybe if you leave your kid alone that way, there is this great longing for mom.
That's good.
Sure. But we need the microphone. Okay. No, just pass it up first. Okay. Sorry for the delay.
First of all, I think this has been a wonderful panel. It's just been fascinating. And I have always wished that I was smarter than I am. And I was wondering, I certainly would not want to trade places with Susan Sontag for all her brilliance, although I would like to be as smart as she is, but I wouldn't like to have been her. And I was wondering if anybody in this room would have liked to have been her.
There is a
I certainly would have.
I think there are many of us who would like to have written 15 or 20 of those essays. Those of us who've spent a lifetime writing essays would certainly like to have written those.
I mean, for me, she was sort of the role model, especially at the age that I realized I was not only going to go into academia, but it was probably going to be a jail sentence for the rest of my life. And and the pressure in academia is to specialize, is to professionalize. And the great thing about Sontag was the fact that she just followed her enthusiasms wherever they took her. And academia really not only doesn't reward you for doing that, but sometimes actively penalizes you for it. So,
I just want to add something. This is it's purely an anecdote. And it's by happenstance that I saw it. The National Book Award ceremony in which she received the National Book Award for On America, I happened to be there because I was on the nonfiction jury, and we share a publisher and an editor. She was sitting at a table with Jonathan Galassi and Farrar Straus, and so when I came into the room, I went over to briefly say hello, and Susan was in a state. She was very nervous. David had been unwell, the son, and it was not clear he was going to show up for this event. It's the one time I've been in that kind of setting, and the Susan Sontag I met over the years, usually in the company of Bob, was one of the most colossally insecure people I have ever met. Usually quite guarded in terms of being, extremely arrogant and cruel and dismissive of people, but just below it, this incredible insecurity. And so we were listening to the gossip from all the publishing people, and this was nobody expected Susan Sontag to win a National Book Award for that novel.
Yeah.
And afterwards, when it was over, I walked back over to the table, and David had materialized at the 11th hour. And Susan, this is the only time she was still in tears. And completely unguarded and overwhelmed, because even though we've talked in sort of humorous ways about how she expected the Pulitzer Prize or this or that, the fact is that the insecurity, I think, was of such a great level that when a kind of recognition like this came, she was completely disarmed. She needed it insatiably, and when the moment arrived, it was like stunning. And the fact that David had shown in at the last moment, it was just, it was very unexpected and moving. It's just like there's a glimpse, of this.
It's very much the way that that Susan was unguarded in talking about the extraordinary pleasure she took in writing those two final novels. A pleasure beyond anything she'd ever experienced as a writer. This talking about this with the Volcano Lover before the book came out, before there were any reviews, just the enormous pleasure which she had never realized she might have as a writer. As a writer of novels, essays, anything. And she was totally unguarded, and I would even go so far as to say openly girlish about this. Her glee was something she wanted to share. And it was extraordinarily, I found it extraordinarily moving and effective to see this. It was quite something. Anyway.
Any other questions?
I've often wondered if Susan had worked as hard on those novels as she had on her essays, if most of the readers who don't like the novels so much would have liked them better. I once said to Diana Trilling, Susan Sontag says she spends 12 drafts on every essay. And Diana said, only 12.
There's a certain ressentiment in that, I think.
But spending all this time
Can you say who you are?
Oh, my name is Sam Kulik. And spending all this time doing all these drafts, hi Roger, there's something journeying about the essays of hers that I've read that is a little open. It doesn't seem so guarded. Her location of the truth as something that you search for and not something that she's dictating to her readers. So I don't see her as such a colossal figure in her writing. She does seem sort of open, and that hasn't really been a part of the discussions.
No, I think she said that the essays in Under the Sign of Saturn, which is probably my favorite book of hers.
Me too. Me too.
Each one, she said, took her 6 months, and she didn't want to do that anymore. And I thought she'd finally reached the proper level of difficulty. That's when she should have continued writing essays. Because, as we all know, to some degree, I'm not saying fiction is easier, but it's a waking dream, and you just kind of. She liked that feeling of submitting to that waking dream, but I'm still much more excited by those 25, 30-page essays. And I would just like to say. Perhaps everyone on the panel will disagree with me, that I like the shorter essays much more than I like the book-length essays. On photography, illness as a metaphor, AIDS as a metaphor, seem to me they have beautiful passages, but then they get too strident and push a certain unreasonable position too far, and they don't really add up in a funny way. So the great work is actually the shorter essays, not the book-length essays.
I agree.
Yeah, and often the numbered essays, like Notes on Camp,
where she does
just beautifully compartmentalized kind of.
When she brings that to bear, that tremendous concentration to bear, those are great work. And they are open.
I'm going to disagree with you about on photography. I'll agree with you about the others.
I like photography too much to.
But on photography was published as, I think, 3 to 4 long essays in the New York Review of Books. And I think that's a brilliant book.
That works.
But there's something so perverse about it. I mean, she loved photography, and she just kept... she wouldn't let that come through in the book. She just kept acting like, the camel was a penis, and that it was a rape, and it was all colonialism of a kind, and it was just yes, there's that, but that's not the only thing there is, and it's not always tourism. It just seemed a kind of lopsided indictment. It was basically a kind of legal brief against photography. And I think she took it too far.
But photography is a social practice. I mean, she doesn't really deal that much with photography as an art in the book. I mean, Diane Arbus.
And I think she's wrong about Diane Arbus. I think, she got on a high horse.
Any other questions?
Nobody mentioned anything about Annie Leibovitz and what factor.
And we've gossiped so much, and we haven't even said anything about it.
Was there a question in the back?
I'm going to say something about Annie Leibovitz. I mean, I think Sontag had great taste, and I think she had great taste in photography. but I don't think Annie Leibovitz is a great photographer, you know. And when I went to her show in the Brooklyn Museum, I thought that a lot of her snapshots were just very banal, and she didn't have that thing that Gary Winograd or Diane Arbus had, this ability to take almost any image. And so I felt sorry for Sontag that, you know, she was a mediocre photographer.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Further information about our programs and a complete archive of past Philip Tatey's events is available at philiptateys.org.